Greetings and salutations, people of the internet. My name is Jingles, and today I'm going to be doing something quite different from what I normally do. There's a topic that's been floating around for a little while now that concerns the supposed dumbing down of the Elder Scrolls games, mostly thanks to Samyoulonline's relatively recent video on the subject. Now, I'd like to preface this little discussion with a few words. First, that I think his video is by all means a very good one. In fact, I agree with a lot of the points he made, and the clarity with which he made them. There's a case to be made for the apparent casualization of the Elder Scrolls series, certainly, but in my mind that's a very simplistic view that's heavily influenced by gaming nostalgia, rather than honest facts. The second thing I'd like to fervently express is that I love the Elder Scrolls games, I really do. I began with Morrowind back in around 2004 or so, and I have a lot of love for that game. As anyone who subscribes to my channel will probably tell you, rants about how Morrowind was superior to subsequent Elder Scrolls titles is something of a staple feature of my videos. However, I do feel that when it comes to Morrowind, far too many people have had their nostalgia goggles so firmly in place that they overlook the many flaws the game possessed, and in some cases go as far as to compare their idealized version of the game to later titles like Oblivion and more recently Skyrim. It's unfortunate because not only is it a warped view to have of the game, it's also preventing people from enjoying the newer titles because all their brain is capable of doing is making constant comparisons to a previous game that probably isn't all as great as you remember it being. I know, I used to do it too. Anyway, in his video, Samyoulonline made a number of specific points with regards to why he thought the Elder Scrolls were being dumbed down as a series. Now, some of these points, as I said, I fully agree with, but I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the problems gamers have with the Elder Scrolls have far more to do with Bethesda's poor design choices than some sort of conspiracy on the part of the filthy casuals. Let's get one thing straight, as much as I or you love the Elder Scrolls games, Bethesda is not a particularly great developer. In fact, compared to other studios out there, they're arguably quite bad. Just look at the clusterfuck that's gone on with Skyrim's DLC for starters, let alone what the core game itself was like on release. The team that developed Morrowind was not the team that developed Oblivion. In fact, the point people criticise the newer games on is their rubbish storylines, and that's mostly because some of Bethesda's most talented writers that worked on Morrowind, like Michael Kirkbride, decided to leave the studio after the game was finished. And likewise, the team that developed Oblivion is not the same team that developed Skyrim. People need to accept this and come to terms with the fact that different games designers have different philosophies when it comes to developing video games. Acting as if all along it's been the same group of guys at Bethesda that have somehow become poisoned by commercial success and have consciously decided to abandon their fans in favour of making more megabucks is completely ridiculous. For one thing, Todd Howard's team doesn't even have to worry about sales. Elder Scrolls games sell like hotcakes regardless of how good or bad they are. For another thing, most of the complaints self-declared hardcore fans of the series have are actually complete nonsense. In a minute I'm going to go over the points I disagreed with in Samyoulonline's video, but what I'm also going to do is try and address them in a broader sense, since these are actually complaints a lot of people make in general, and deserve a more general answer rather than me picking apart the content of one specific video. So without further ado, one of the first points Samyoulonline brings up is that quest characters in Oblivion and Skyrim cannot die. This is entirely true, and it's also true that it has an effect on the player's sense of immersion. That kind of hand-holding is unwelcome, naturally, but as I'm about to explain, Bethesda had a very good reason for doing it, and it's not to appeal to casual gamers. As many of you undoubtedly know, Oblivion introduced a fairly groundbreaking concept to the Elder Scrolls series, so-called Radiant AI. Where previously NPCs would stand or wander around in a single spot night and day, never eating, never sleeping, never interacting with one another, they now suddenly gained some semblance to actual human beings. People in the game would wake up in the morning, eat their breakfast, leave the house, lock the front door, set up their shops, visit the pub, or even travel to a different city, all before heading home to sleep for the night. The world suddenly felt far more alive as people went about daily routines and, more importantly, did them even while the player was absent. However, with this kind of behaviour on the part of the NPCs, there comes new problems. NPCs could often end up getting themselves inadvertently injured or even killed, in ways that were very difficult to predict. More than once when I played the game, I encountered a beggar brutally cut down by the town guards for stealing some food, or simply NPCs that had taken a big fall from a ledge, or he'd been ambushed by a bandit while travelling between towns and died. Sometimes they even got in fights amongst themselves for accidentally hitting an ally in combat. Skyrim took this to an even greater level, with far more NPCs doing far more activities, and all the time in more danger than before. The addition of random dragon encounters, even in towns and villages, meant that just about any NPC could be indiscriminately murdered at any given time, with the little the player could do to stop it. In fact, this was very much a selling point of the game. Remember Todd Howard explaining how NPCs would take over the duties of another one that had died? Think about how Isolde will take over Belethor's general goods in Whiterun if Belethor is killed, and you'll get the idea. However, all of this presents a very big problem. How do you deal with quest characters? In some cases, an NPC could be swapped in using the Radiant system, but more often than not it simply wouldn't work. Imagine if Jarl Balgruuf had a pathing error and took a tumble off the Dragon's Reach balcony in your absence. No more main quest for you. Or what about if Ulfric Stormcloak got killed by a dragon attacking Windhelm? Well, Civil War was over a bit quickly, wasn't it? Fun while it lasted, eh? So the question is, are you prepared to put up with important NPCs having a chance of randomly dying off because of the nature of the Radiant system? Or would you rather just make them invincible so that you're not denied being able to access particular quests just because of a random act of God that was beyond your control? The whole argument for making all NPCs mortal in the first place is that doing away with them will be solely at the player's discretion. But in a more modern Elder Scrolls game, that simply wouldn't be the case anymore. That is why Bethesda introduced essential NPCs, not to appeal to casual gamers as if it's some sort of bloody conspiracy on their part to attack the hardcore gaming community. And if in spite of all this you still want your NPCs to be killable, then fine, because the game is moddable. In fact, I used to have a mod installed that did just that, but deleted it after Delphine died halfway to Kynesgrove while I wasn't there to protect her. In fact, stuff like this was the very reason why Bethesda keeps their games so freely customizable, because they know they aren't going to be able to please everybody. A consolation prize of being given the tools to make the changes you want to see is hardly a bad thing, and you'd have to go to a really desperate stretch to suggest that it's legitimate dumbing down on their part. Here, Samyoulonline begins by explaining that joining different factions in Morrowind had the effect of changing your reputation with other factions, which added depth to the game. I would argue that's actually an incorrect, or at the very least very shallow, statement, and to show you what I mean, let's have a closer look at what he's actually referring to on a more basic level. What did a change in your reputation with other factions actually do? Well, essentially, it just altered the disposition bar for NPCs of a given faction. That is quite literally it. This, according to him, is one of the things that gave Morrowind its depth, and made it feel like a living, breathing world. However, factions themselves didn't actively react to you in any meaningful way. Only the NPCs were passively affected, and what's more, these side effects could be very easily countered by simply dumping a bag of gold in their hands through Morrowind's very crude speechcraft and bribery system. In fact, an even easier way to counter it was to simply join their faction, completely wiping the slate clean and making those same NPCs that hated you minutes ago worship the ground you tread on. And this is a perfect example of what I mean when I say that the factions in Morrowind didn't really react to the player. You could quite feasibly have a character that was a member of the Imperial Legion, the Tribunal Temple, and House Telvanni all at the same time. These were three factions that were ideologically and politically opposed to one another in just about every conceivable way. And yet the game had no qualms about letting the Imperial Legion commander of Vardenfell sign up with the Temple, a fiercely religious organisation that associated closely with the most xenophobic organisations in Morrowind, like the Redoran and Indoril. This same character might then head on over to Great House Telvanni, a group so proud and arrogant that it doesn't even recognise the rule of Imperial law, and is characterised by its equal hatred of not only the Empire, but the Tribunal Temple. To imagine that these two factions would not only allow entrance to an active Imperial Legion officer, but would tolerate his rise through the ranks to become Archmagister or Archcanon, simply destroys any potential suspension of disbelief. Is this the depth and immersion you were talking about? 'Cause I'm not seeing it. Oddly enough, you could only join one of the great houses in the game, which makes a degree of sense, but frankly I'm far less willing to put it down to an attempt by Bethesda to make the world more believable, and more inclined to see it as a measure put in place to prevent the player from skipping a very lengthy section of the main quest, in which you need to seek approval from the different members of the great houses, a section that could already be shortened significantly if you were a leader of one of them already. And speaking of the main quest, this brings me to another example of where the supposedly immersive nature of factions' relations to the player completely break down. In that same section where the player must seek to have himself named Hortitor, which for those unfamiliar with Morrowind's storyline is a kind of impartial war leader whose task is to unite the Dark Elves against a common enemy. Why is it that almost no comment is made by the various NPCs involved when a player already loyal to one of the three houses attempts to have himself named as Supreme Warlord? A triviality easily ignored, you might say, and that's fine, but there's another even bigger example of both the game and the factions within it ignoring the player's accomplishments and affiliations. There comes a point in the main quest where the player must publicly declare himself the Nerevarine. In other words, the reincarnation of the ancient leader of the early Dark Elves. The act of doing so is considered a grave heresy by the ruling tribunal temple, whose guards will attempt to attack you on sight after this point in the quest has passed. However, the game doesn't alter the situation depending on the relations of the player to other in-game factions. For instance, you would imagine that if the player was Archcanon of the entire temple and then declared himself to be Nerevarine, it would create a very different response to, say, a Telvanni Archmagister, a Hlalu noble, or even some random adventurer claiming the same. However, the game doesn't recognise that. In fact, you aren't even expelled from the temple. Nobody apparently cares, and in a farcical episode that follows, you are made to meet with the former Archcanon, who by this point is retired, but NPCs don't refer to him as being so. You're told to go to his office, which should in fact be your office by now, where you are given the blessing of the temple in your quest. Yes, that's right, you, head of the entire temple, must be given the temple's blessing by your retired predecessor. When I learned all this for myself years ago by actually playing the game down that particular path to see what would happen, I was incredibly disappointed, and it was one instance among many that revealed to me the often paper-thin facade of depth in Morrowind. In all fairness, it's a problem that every Elder Scrolls game has suffered with, but Morrowind suffered with it the most. At least in Oblivion, there was some recognition of your role in the goings-on in Cyrodiil. Remember the Mad Priest and Anvil that begins the Knights of the Nine DLC? If you'd saved the city of Kvatch from the Daedra, when asked if you were worthy of his quest, you could tell the priest that you were the hero of Kvatch. Alternatively, if you'd completed the main quest, you could tell him that you were the champion of Cyrodiil, and he even replied with a suitably sarcastic rebuke for both arrogant dialogue options. In Skyrim, things change again. Individual faction members rarely treat you any differently, regardless of what other organisations you're signed up with. But if we think about it, doesn't that make sense? How exactly are they supposed to know what factions you even belong to? Real people don't all share an omniscient knowledge of a single individual unless they're exceptionally famous. In most cases during your Skyrim playthrough, it's likely they've never even met you before, and even if they've heard of you, they probably don't know what you look like all too well. Tamriel's got a long way to go after all before it invents the camera, and it's not as if you walk around with big badges denoting your allegiance. Walking around in Morrowind, on the other hand, sometimes feels like you've got a load of crap political bumper stickers stuck all over you. The only case where this kind of thing would be true is if you were with either the Legion or the Stormcloaks, and there is an appropriate response for that. Ever tried walking into Solitude dressed as a Stormcloak? If not, I recommend you give it a go. The results can be quite amusing. And all this aside, while NPCs' attitudes towards you aren't arbitrarily altered due to your own affiliations, there are still other consequences that honestly feel far more realistic. For example, if you manage to piss off the Thalmor, they'll dispatch squads of Justiciars to try and assassinate you. Others will call upon the Dark Brotherhood, or simply send a gang of armed thugs to teach you a lesson. If it became a problem, you could simply try and eliminate the person responsible, or in the Dark Brotherhood's case, plot and successfully destroy the entire faction. Now this all boils down to the main point of Samyoulonline's argument. The faction relations have been taken away to appeal to casual gamers, and I simply don't believe that's the case. In many demonstrable ways, the consequences of the player's interactions with different guilds, groups, and organisations of Tamriel have actually become more believable and realistic as the games have progressed, and that's not something I'd even remotely consider to be dumbing down. Quite the opposite, in fact. This is an awkward one, mainly because in many ways I agree that the current journal and quest setups are far from ideal. However, what I will say is that the dreaded quest marker sooner or later was going to become a necessity. Why? Well, have you even played Morrowind? For example, do you remember this fine lady? I'd wager some of you do. You might not know her name, and you might not even remember where she is or what faction she belongs to, but what probably did stick in your head is that she gave you a quest to kill some mudcrabs in the arse end of nowhere, and gave you the worst possible directions to get there. The first time I did that quest, I spent literally hours trying to follow her list of directions to no avail. mainly because they were actually wrong and didn't take into account whole parts of the landscape that could easily cause confusion. In fact, the easiest way to do this quest was to just head west out of town and blindly wander around for a while until you found what you were looking for. For every person that says they prefer the immersion of getting in-game directions instead of a quest marker, I point to this woman. An NPC remembered by many not because of how she looked, how she spoke, or because she had an interesting personality, but because she gave such horribly broken quest directions. When that's something that players remember your NPCs for above all else, you failed as a game designer, but that's a topic I'll go into a bit later. We look back at the frustration this kind of thing caused as quaintly charming years later, but that kind of archaic nonsense has no place in a modern game. You must understand that this isn't about some kind of pathetic appeal to casual gamers, it's simply making the life of all players a bit easier. Sometimes your immersion really does just have to take a hit for the sake of gameplay. After all, it's not as if your character has to spend an hour with 2 followers on the spot in order to be able to put on their plate armor. Granted, that level of realism would add to immersion, but it would be an incredibly clunky game mechanic that most players would quickly tire of. This is not about casual gamers. I am by most standards a hardcore gamer. As I said, I've played every Elder Scrolls title ever since I began with Morrowind at around 2004, and I'm generally a pretty fanatical fan of the series, but I do actually enjoy having a quest marker. It certainly beats spending a few frustrating hours tramping around the wilderness searching for that one cave that doesn't seem to exist. It's just one of those gameplay features that, like many others, that has been added over time for the sake of convenience, like the quick save button, crosshairs in first-person view, or the stealth indicator, none of which I'm sure you detest to any degree. Trying to put it down to the casual gamer conspiracy is actually pretty short-sighted, especially since features like this in games are hardly a new thing. After all, there's nothing dumb about doing away with a feature of the game that's quite simply broken. Of all the points Samyoulonline raised in his video, this was the one that stuck out the most, and actually was the one that made me think about doing this entire response in the first place. He argues that Morrowind sported extensive, enthralling dialogue, and that there was a definite point in engaging in conversation with random townsfolk to learn what unique insights you could from these different characters. I don't see how you could be more wrong. He's right in that Morrowind's dialogue was extensive, very extensive in fact. There were dozens of topics available for discussion, which is, in truth, something of a contrast with Skyrim and even Oblivion. It will probably come as no surprise, however, when I say that I disagree this is because of casual gamers, or even that it's necessarily a bad thing in the first place. Morrowind had a lot of NPCs, all of which you could talk to and ask them about pretty much whatever subject took your fancy. Great, some might say, that's so much better than Skyrim's NPCs. But take a closer look. Almost every NPC in Morrowind gives you the same answer to every question. Exactly the same. Copy-pasted, in fact. Regardless of who it is or where they are, with a few exceptions, they'll tell you the same thing about almost any given subject word for word. This is horribly immersion-breaking, especially for someone going into Morrowind after playing the newer titles. Think about it, there's less dialogue overall, but far more importantly in Skyrim, there's much more characterization. Let's take a look at Whiterun, for instance. In terms of NPCs, we've got a disgruntled widow that hates men, a grieving old woman that lost her son to the war, a single mother constantly harassed by the menfolk of the city, a sleazy beggar that spends all of his money on drink, an imperial blacksmith with a clear inferiority complex, a Nord blacksmith that is so single-mindedly devoted to his work that even making small talk with customers is irritating to him, a sycophantic petty noble that spends more time with the Jarl than with his wife, and there's even a Romeo and Juliet thing going on between John Battleworn and Ulfina Greymane if you stick around long enough to hear them talking to one another. And there's plenty more examples like this besides. Let's look at Morrowind on the other hand. With quest characters and some small exceptions aside, there isn't a single bit of personality to any of the random townsfolk that inhabit the world of Morrowind. All they have to offer is a number of copy-pasted responses to a long shopping list of topics that you will have heard all the answers to after your first playthrough of the game. All NPCs exist to do is dispense quests and generic information about the world. It's like living in a country full of fucking talking vending machines. And of the dialogue that does exist, most of it is incredibly stilted and painfully contrived in order to be able to fit as many of the dialogue hyperlinks that the system relies on into each sentence. Try it for yourself. Walk up to an innkeeper in Morrowind and observe the confusing paragraph of speech they respond with. People in Morrowind just don't talk like real people, they talk like a tourist information brochure. Is there someone in particular you are looking for? How about the local services? Latest rumours? If you like, I could give you a little secret or some Morrowind lore. As I've said, characterization is the key here. It's what makes NPCs memorable and likeable. Think of characters from games like Planescape Torment, Baldur's Gate, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, or even Obsidian's Fallout New Vegas. Fucking Call of Duty has better characterization than Morrowind most of the time. Hell, I bet some of you recall people from Morrowind like the outrageously perverted Crassius Curio, or Jaeger and Bagan. Why? Because these people actually had interesting things to say, because they had some semblance of personality. The fact that Morrowind's NPCs are so damn empty and faceless is the reason why things like the less generic NPC project exists. Bethesda moving away from the old Morrowind method is far from an appeal to casual gamers, or even something that could be considered dumbing down. It's quite the opposite, in fact. While I will say that Bethesda still have a long way to go when it comes to writing genuinely intriguing characters with some degree of depth, their move in this direction is to be applauded. And rather than dumbing down, it's actually a far more mature approach to world design and writing, an approach that in today's world of game design is entirely necessary. In a world where we have studios like BioWare creating whole casts of memorable and well-written characters, and even Obsidian using Bethesda's own game engine in Fallout New Vegas to create some fantastic and colourful NPCs, a return to Morrowind's outdated and archaic keyword-based dialogue system is simply impossible, and frankly undesirable. If you really do want NPCs without any personality at all, that serve only to blurt out random world info whenever you speak to them, go and play a Pokemon game or something, because The Elder Scrolls is thankfully beginning to outgrow that type of gameplay. Well, that's about all I have to say on the subject of Samyoulonline's video. What I would like to say in a more general sense, though, is that people really need to take off the rose-tinted glasses from time to time. That is, after all, where many of the complaints like this come from, and frankly I'm sick of hearing them. Well, that's all from me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it convinced one or two people to put their nostalgia goggles aside, and more closely examine their treasured titles like Morrowind with a more mature and critical eye. And if not, well, I hope you were at least entertained. If you want to see more, you can have a look at my channel. I make Let's Plays and people generally seem to enjoy them, so they might be worth your time. I might even do some more opinion pieces like this depending on how well this video performs. After all, there's plenty more topics like this I'd love to discuss. Anyway, my name has been Jingles, and thank you very much for watching.